What if I told you that in the sweltering plains of 1850s Texas, rats were seen stumbling through towns like drunkards, collapsing into barrels, scurrying into walls, twitching like they'd had too much whiskey? At first, people laughed it off. Those vermin must have gotten into the saloon, they'd say. But the laughter stopped when the rats began dying, and so did the people. By the time anyone took it seriously, entire households were infected with something the newspapers couldn't even name. They just called it the drunken rat plague. Now here's the twist. While the official line was a rodent-borne plague, private letters hinted at something far more sinister: a secret military testing site, a breach, an outbreak that was never meant to happen. Could it be that this bizarre, almost comical epidemic was actually the smoke from a fire the government desperately tried to bury? Stick around, because what starts as a story of twitchy rats and fevered hallucinations may lead us straight into the heart of one of the strangest conspiracies buried in early American medical history. And trust me, by the end, you'll never look at a rat or your local government the same way again. Picture this: Texas, 1853. Not the oil-rich, cattle kingdom Texas we think of today, but a wild, dusty, semi-lawless expanse where the heat could fry an egg on your saddle, and the town doctor was usually also the barber, and occasionally the bartender. Settlers had poured in chasing farmland, freedom, and depending on who you asked, a chance to escape something back east. In these tiny frontier towns, places like Bell's Landing and Dogleg Creek, life was tough but rhythmic. People rose with the sun, fed the chickens, mistrusted the government, and tried not to die of snakebite or bad whiskey. Kids played marbles in the dirt. Old men traded stories outside saloons with names like the Rusty Spur or Shot Glass and Sons. And rats? Well, rats were just part of the scenery. Every barn had a few, every cellar had more, and nobody thought twice about it. Until one spring morning, the rats started acting weird. We're talking walking in circles, climbing furniture like drunk uncles at a wedding, flopping onto their backs with tiny spasms that, according to one diary, looked like they'd lost a dance battle with the devil. The town preacher called it a sign from God. The town doctor blamed fermented cornmeal, but neither had answers when children started coming down with tremors, or when a family in nearby Matagorda fell fatally ill after finding a nest of dead rodents in their well. Newspapers at the time, those scrappy single-page sheets passed from porch to porch, ran headlines like, "Plague or Providence? Bell's Landing besieged by rat madness. Doctor claims rats too drunk to die, yet people are dropping." Doctors from Houston were summoned, so were Army officers. That's when things got quiet, too quiet. Locals reported men in long coats collecting soil samples under moonlight. A postmaster's wife claimed her letters were being opened before delivery, and one farmer swore he saw a wagon loaded with rat corpses in glass jars heading toward a military camp outside Austin. So how did a seemingly absurd epidemic go from joke to classified overnight? Who was really behind the sudden silence? And what exactly was in those rats? The deeper we dig, the weirder it gets. Let's rewind to that eerie spring night in April 1853, when the town of Bell's Landing fell silent. Not from sleep, but from dread. It started with the sudden disappearance of Sheriff Amos Cotter. He'd been investigating a string of animal deaths: chickens, goats, even a mule that collapsed mid-step. Witnesses claimed he was last seen outside the grain mill, lantern in hand, muttering about those blasted rats. By morning, all that remained was his hat, floating in a water trough, and a trail of what looked like gnawed paper leading into the woods. Then came the markings. Miners near Dogleg Creek stumbled across bizarre symbols scratched into limestone outcroppings. Swirls, arrows, and some kind of repeating sigil that looked suspiciously like a stylized rat with its spine bent backward. A visiting geologist from Galveston took sketches and promptly fell violently ill the next day. Locals started calling the place the Cursed Cut. And just when you thought it couldn't get stranger, it did. Reports surfaced of rats running not away from humans, but toward them. A farmer named Elias Cobb claimed a dozen rodents rushed his cabin one night, scratching at the door like they were trying to get in. His wife swore they were moving together like soldiers, not animals. Cobb moved his family inland the next morning and refused to ever speak of it again. Let's fast forward to the now lost journal of Dr. Thaddeus Greaves, the town's only formally trained physician. One entry reads, "Subject number 14, rat, eyes cloudy, limbs twitch in rhythmic spasms, secretes a milky substance from mouth, identical to samples on afflicted children's bedding. This is no ordinary disease." Later, Dr. Greaves describes being approached by two military men with polished boots and no names, asking him to surrender all notes and patient records. He hid a few pages in a family Bible. They weren't found until 1927 during a house demolition. And then there were the trains that never came. Residents reported hearing whistles in the middle of the night, long, low howls carried by the wind. But no tracks ran near those towns. One teenager swore he saw lantern lights floating in the woods, moving at perfect speed and rhythm, like a phantom train slicing through the trees. By morning, several homesteads had been found abandoned, with food still on the table and fires still warm. The official word, mass hysteria. But not everyone bought that. In oral records preserved by the great-granddaughter of a local preacher, we find chilling fragments of bedtime stories told to keep kids inside. If the rats start dancing, bar your doors. If the air smells like copper, don't breathe too deep. And if the men in black hats knock, don't let them in, even if they call you by name. So what exactly was going on in Texas during the so-called drunken rat plague? Were the rats the cause or the symptom? Why did official records vanish? And who decided the story wasn't worth remembering? Because here's the thing, all these years later, no conclusive cause has ever been recorded. No mass graves, no medical breakthrough, just fragments, burnt notes, eerie carvings, and letters sealed with wax that melted away too easily. But don't worry, we're not done yet. What comes next might be the most surprising part of all. Now let's put on our detective hats, preferably not ones chewed through by rodents, and dive into what the surviving clues actually tell us. First, the government response. Or should we say, the suspicious absence of one. We found a reference to a classified report in the archives of the Texas State Medical Examiner titled Biological Incursions, Bell County, 1853. It's listed, but the document itself? Gone. The entry's been blacked out with the same ink the Army used for Civil War dispatches. Coincidence? Maybe. But when you dig deeper, you find that in early 1854, Bell's Landing was quietly removed from several postal maps, effectively erased, as if the town had never existed. Next up, those mysterious symbols on the limestone. A team of symbologists from the University of Texas examined rubbings taken in the 1920s. According to their notes, the markings bear a curious resemblance to alchemical diagrams from 16th century Europe, specifically ones associated with the extraction and control of pestilence. One researcher joked, "It's like someone tried to cast a spell on the land and botched the ritual." Another, less amused, noted that the same spiral pattern appeared in quarantine zones during the 1918 flu pandemic. Let's talk rats. Disease-bearing rodents aren't new. But synchronized behavior, attacking humans? That's another story. We contacted Dr. Lenora Fay, a modern-day epidemiologist who specializes in zoonotic outbreaks. Her take? If the rats were truly clustering, seizing, and approaching humans as described, it's possible, though extremely rare, that they were exposed to a potent neurotoxin. She paused, then added, or someone tested one. She's referring to a compound known as Agent V9, a rudimentary nerve agent developed, wait for it, at Fort Detrick, a full century later. But oddly, the original formula was based on research smuggled out of Germany in the mid-1800s. And who was stationed in Texas in 1853? That's right, military chemists attached to an experimental sanitation division. So were the rats sick or made sick? Let's not forget the local stories. According to descendants, strange colored fogs rolled in right before outbreaks. One family swore their cow's milk turned pink. Another claimed their chickens laid soft, translucent eggs. We're not saying this is definitive proof of environmental poisoning, but if it walks like a cover-up and reeks like a dead rat, maybe we shouldn't just write it off as frontier imagination. And then there was the case of Old Ned. In 1974, a hobbyist named Ned Trelawney tried to recreate the so-called plague effect by trapping swamp rats and feeding them fermented grains soaked in lead runoff. He claimed success until his shed caught fire under mysterious circumstances and all of his notes were lost. The official cause? Combustion due to poor wiring. But friends said Ned had no electricity. So here's where we land. Between government denials, disappearing towns, ancient symbols, neurotoxins, and a pile of rodents behaving like they'd seen the end of days. We still don't have a definitive answer, but we're not quite done. Because what if this wasn't just about a disease? What if Bell's Landing was a testing ground for something much bigger? So, what really happened in Texas in 1853? Was it an outbreak of an undiscovered plague, driven by filthy conditions and hot weather? A freak neurological reaction passed from rat to human? Or was it something far more controlled, more intentional? An early experiment swept under the nearest government-issued rug. Here's what we know. The symptoms were real. The disappearances were real. The military's sudden involvement in the erasure of entire towns from maps, also very real. But the cause? Still buried somewhere between speculation, scorched documents, and a silence that's lasted for over 170 years. And maybe that's the most unsettling part, because it means something this bizarre, this grotesque could happen again, and we might never know. All it takes is a forgotten lab, a quiet cover-up, and a few twitching rats in the wrong place at the wrong time. Now I'll leave you with this thought. If the truth really died with the last survivor of Bell's Landing, who made sure no one else would dig it up? Or maybe, just maybe, we're still standing on it. If you've got a theory, a hometown legend, or even a family story that sounds eerily similar, drop it in the comments. We want to hear the wild ones, the ones that never made it into textbooks. And hey, if you enjoyed this dive into the forgotten corners of history, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more unfiltered historical deep dives, and share this video with anyone who loves weird, true, and unexplainable stories. Next episode? Well, it is a kind of mineral that emits a cold blue light at night. That's all I can say. See you in the next episode.